Thank you. So for those of you who don't know me, I don't have a Who Am I slide, but I am one of the organizers of DevOps Days Columbus. It's September 19th to the 20th. The CFP is not open, but Columbus, if you're not familiar with Columbus, Ohio, has a lot of insurance and banking and retail companies. Brands like Limited, so Victoria's Secrets, Express, Abercrombie, Big Lots, to name a whole bunch of other retailers as well. So I know there's a lot of people in Seattle that are into that same industry. First year we had Courtney Kessler from Nordstrom come out and give a talk. So anyone from REI or Nike or Columbia or anyone else in the room who's in that vertical, it'd be a good opportunity to talk to your peers in that other space, which is all about what DevOps is about, right? So I'm gonna walk through, this is a rough agenda, so I'm gonna clear some thoughts about DevOps. I'm going to help define what Cloud Native is, looking at a couple definitions that have been put out there. And then we're going to talk about the intersection of DevOps and Cloud Native, and then also touch on a bit about roles in a Cloud Native world. How many people who work for large enterprises? Fair number of you. How many of you just went through a DevOps transformation? A few of you, right? How many of you just have a DevOps team? Majority of you, or a fair number of you. And so as we have these new technologies come about, we start to then define new roles and new jobs. And then you start to see marketing that kind of confuses the situation where marketers will put, find out how DevOps is so over and cloud native operations is the new thing. Join us on our webinar with this analyst. And it just starts to kind of confuse the situation a little bit. And as Tom pointed out, there's still plenty of work for us to do in the serverless world. It's just that we're working on different things and we get to focus on different problems. And that's much the same as we look at DevOps and Cloud Native. So let's dive into it. We got a little bit of a history today, so let me just skim through this, since if everyone was in the keynote session this morning, you've already heard this. So Andrew proposed this idea of Agile infrastructure at the Agile conference. Only one person showed up, and that was Patrick. I had always confused the two of who proposed it and who showed up, but only one person showed up. Even the person that proposed it didn't show up. We, of course, have already heard about this. John Allspaw and Paul Hammond, they gave a talk at Velocity titled 10 Deploys Per Day. And then the first DevOps Days was held in Ghent. So I'm already telling you a lot of stuff that we already know, so I can move a little faster. Oh, I forgot to start my timer. So that means I get extra time, right? So also the origins of DevOps, two gentlemen who have been in the world of DevOps for a long time. One of them is John Willis. Another one is Damon Edwards. And they kind of coined this term CAMS, or this acronym CAMS. And later it evolves into comms as a gentleman by the name of Jez Humble gets involved and starts to bring in the practices and principles of lean. And so what that really stands for is culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing, right? And for the longest time in the DevOps community, this really kind of was the areas that we started to focus on, especially as talks were proposed and things like that, and the whole DevOps community started growing and the DevOps Days community started growing. You try to bucket your talk or what you would want to talk about in these different areas, right? And sharing things of how you applied lean to your day-to-day processes, about how we reinvent, how we measure things, how we need to have cultures of inclusion and diversity and other things like that as well. And so let's boil down each one of those letters and what they mean. So culture. So culture focuses on, and this is all from John's blog post, which is at the end, linked at the end. And so people over process. So we value that we have healthy humans versus processes that drive them nuts and burns them out and makes them want to quit. We have a freedom of failure. So like from our talk today, this whole idea, or this morning by John, about this whole idea of root cause analysis and trying to find the failure point or the individual that caused that problem. Instead, you have a freedom to fail, and more importantly, learning from that failure so that we don't make the same mistakes again. And then that ideas should be able to come from anyone, not just certain individuals. And you saw this in organizations that follow a build, plan, run type model. The people who run the systems actually get no choice about how they're built or how they're planned out and how they're architected. And that what ends up happening is they don't get to feed back into that build and plan phases what works and what doesn't work when you actually try to run this thing in production. The other thing is trying to get rid of hierarchies, and it's just not the architects that are the ones that should be designing the systems, but it should be everybody that should be designing the systems across development and operations and security and all the other teams. So automation, making sure that we automate our entire software delivery lifecycle, and this is really where the DevOps principles start to kind of realize themselves in tangible tools, right? So infrastructure as code with Chef and Puppet and other things like that. Continuous integration, making sure that we have testing when we're building our software, and then testing along the deployment path as well by doing things like continuous delivery as well. Lean focuses on manufacturing processes. So the easiest way to describe what lean is, and it's probably from a book definition perspective, not 100% accurate, but it's accurate enough for you to move on with your life. We don't need to be pedantic about it, but it's about removing waste from processes, right? And the best example of this is there's an exercise in lean where you basically go and you draw out a current state of a process. One that I always like to do in the world of automation, I used to work at Chef, so this is one that I would use a lot with our customers, was you would draw out how a server gets built, right? And so how do you go from request for a server to a server in somebody's hands, or a server actually running in production taking requests? And you map out that entire process, you map out how long each phase of the process takes, and then you can start to see where your bottlenecks are and where the time is most spent. And then you automate that first thing, and you get it down from 2 weeks for the process to take place to a couple of minutes, and then you go and find the next bottleneck in the process and you just work through that, right? And then what you end up creating is a future state map where you've removed, hopefully, most of that waste. Measurement, DevOps really has changed the way that we think about measurement. So performance metrics not only performance metrics of how your systems are ran and what metrics we actually care about and metrics that we should look at. So going back to Tom's talk, I'm not sure who all was in that, but Tom basically was talking about focusing on the outcome versus how we get to that outcome. And a lot of measurement definitely focuses on that in the DevOps world. And then people metrics as well, where we don't, process metrics where we talked about lean and removing waste and can we have optimized systems in that perspective, but then also people metrics. And people metrics from a couple different ways. So going back to the culture aspect of it, thinking about how our culture is impacting the people's metrics and making sure that our people are healthy and kept in a healthy state. But then also, do the investments I make influence things in my business, right? The health of the people, but also the amount of money that the business is making. Can we innovate faster? Can we do things like that? And the great example of that is the DevOps Research Associates and the work that they're doing, and of course around the work that they do with Puppet and the State of DevOps report. The State of DevOps report is, I want to say, is it in the 5th edition or 4th edition? So there's a lot of data that's been taken and actually analyzed and looked at and say, does DevOps have a positive impact? And adopting the comms methodology of DevOps, does it have a positive impact on my organization? And then lastly, sharing. So inter-organization sharing, inter-organization sharing. So a great example of that is when competing companies, how many people have talked to a competitor here today? Well, former competitor. But yeah, we can share information, we can find out what's going on. And that's why I invited you all to come and speak at DevOps Days Columbus and make my community better, because anyone from the retail sector here can then go and connect with people in the retail sector there, and you can share information about how you all are handling things and working on things and the challenges that that specific vertical faces. And it's really about sharing best practices and learnings to help improve the overall industry. And what's interesting is if you look at kind of technology talks and the conferences, a lot of people say that there are too many conferences, but what's interesting is we're getting more and more conferences where it's just not vendors up here pitching you something, but it's vendors, or it's people from the community and the people who have hands-on every day able to share real-world experiences. And I think DevOps has been a great catalyst to help those things become more popular. So A further, less drawn out definition of the one John did, John's is very almost DevOps manifesto-ish. A more simple definition is by Adam Jacob, the CTO of Chef. DevOps is a cultural and professional movement focused on how we build and operate high-velocity organizations born from the experiences of its practitioners. And you can see some of the aspects of comms in that definition, right? Especially born from the experiences of a practitioner, how we operate at high velocities, so removing waste from our processes and so forth. So let's talk about Cloud Native and what Cloud Native is. So how many people would say that they're running a microservices architecture, Cloud Native, containers, Kubernetes, or anything like that in production right now? Okay, so probably about 25% of you. So Cloud Native kind of focuses on 3 different aspects, and they're actually going through the process of rewriting this definition. So if you look on the website, it might have changed by now. I know they were in flight on doing that right now. But if you look at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's website, they say that a cloud native computing application uses open source software to be containerized. So it's packaged in its own container, and that's the unit of deployment, or that's the artifact that gets shipped around. Dynamically orchestrated, so it's actively scheduled and managed to optimize utilization. And then it's microservices oriented, so it focuses on the application, focuses on the smallest area of concern as possible in terms of the business service that it's trying to serve. So it's not a monolith in that regard. And that is the goal of introducing or increasing overall agility and maintainability of applications. So another definition by a local, Joe Bita. I should one day ask him how he pronounces his last name. Sorry, Joe, if I messed it up. I can ask him tomorrow morning. So he's our opening talk tomorrow, but he defines it as, in a blog post that he wrote a few years ago, that Cloud Native is structuring teams, culture, and technology to utilize automation and architectures to manage complexity and unlock velocity. So it seems like this definition where you're not having these bullet points, between the definition of that Joe gave and the definition that Adam gave, there's definitely a little bit of overlap. So unlocking velocity, culture and technology as well, and all about structuring the teams or the organizations to unlock that velocity. Now, Pivotal also has their own definition. They've been doing a lot in the cloud native world. Of course, they have the platform as a service, and they contribute a lot to Cloud Foundry. And so they define it as cloud native is an approach to building and running applications that fully exploit the advantages of the cloud computing model. And if you go and look at how they encapsulate things, they basically say that it's a process of incorporating DevOps, continuous delivery, microservices, and containers, and that helps you unlock that velocity in the organization. So, confused? All right, so let's start to kind of look at the intersection between DevOps and Cloud Native. So I kind of rewrote this definition, really kind of expanding the top and saying that Cloud Native is an approach to building and running applications that fully exploits the advantages of the cloud computing model. In particular, Cloud Native takes advantage of technological advances to build and deploy applications that are containerized, dynamically orchestrated, and microservices oriented. The interesting thing about this, though, is we're definitely missing something from the DevOps definition, right? We're missing this culture of sharing, and we're missing the culture aspect as well. So how does DevOps and Cloud Native start to kind of come together? And I created, so furthering these definitions and boiling them down and comparing them. So DevOps is a cultural and professional movement focused on culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing. And then Cloud Native is a technological paradigm that focuses on a repeatable pattern of building applications leveraging containers, automation, and microservices. And if you overlay the two on top of each other, kind of thinking of where they begin to fit in, you can see that there's actually a lot of overlap. And I kind of feel like this is almost that it's a side effect of technological advances. So we've been having this conversation around DevOps for a really long time. We've had these technological advances that come along at the same time and start to deliver this promise of velocity and making things a lot easier to deploy. And they start to overlap much more than you think, right? Which is this whole idea is that Cloud Native is here, DevOps is over, let's move on, or serverless is here, DevOps is over, let's move on. It's really not the case because the technological advances are going to fit into a few areas where the culture and the sharing aspects are still very, very important to the overall organization and what we do in an organization. I don't know why it won't advance. Let me just do it manually. So let's dive into how Cloud Native improves DevOps. And it improves it in, as I just said, automation, measurement, and lean. So the interesting thing about the definitions, when you look at the definitions, is that automation is a first principle, right? It's built into the platform, and the tenets of scaling are built into the platform as well. It assumes that when you deploy an application to something like Kubernetes, is that it is going to be able to be dynamically scaled. You're able to automatically set how many maximum number of instances you want of a particular container, and it will automatically scale that up for you. You're able to set resource limits so that if those resource limits are hit, that will create the scaling event for you automatically. And a lot of those tenets that we used to try and do and we build the orchestration around when we were using something like config management starts to go away. So when we saw Tom look in my Twitter feed, not Tom look in my Twitter feed, sorry, I'm mumbling my words or crossing my words. So if you look at my Twitter feed, Tom had a very good slide that talked about what everything that goes away when you move from traditional infrastructure to serverless. You could create a very similar diagram when you talk about moving from traditional infrastructure to a containerized platform or a cloud native platform as well. And you get a lot of those same benefits because a lot of those things that we had to worry about before are being baked into the platform and abstracted away from it for us. Let me reboot it. Yay. So automation also makes things like infrastructure as code easier. So you have the benefits of immutability of containers. You know what you're going to package up. You know you have some guarantees of what's inside of it. Let me put it that way. It's not 100% guarantees all the time. You're further abstracted away from the infrastructure, so you start to care less about that infrastructure, just like when you move to a serverless world or you start consuming more cloud provider provided services, you start to worry about those concerns much less. And then it starts to become less brittle than traditional configuration management because you have these principles of automation already built into the platform and the orchestration's taken care of at that level for you. And now all you need to do is write some YAML, right? We're all YAML engineers. A good example is GitOps. GitOps is something that's come out of Weaveworks. And it's basically this whole paradigm of how you deploy applications using continuous delivery on top of Kubernetes, and how you take a lot of the learnings that we had in the infrastructure as code world, if you use Chef or Puppet or Ansible or Salt or a tool like that, and how you start to take those same principles and ideas and apply them to this new platform of Kubernetes and how you automate in that way. And then orchestration's incorporated from the start as well. So that's a very key component inside of a cloud native platform, is having this ability of orchestration, and you're no longer writing those messy orchestration steps yourself. You also get things like automatic circuit breakers. So there's a new, kind of a young technology called service mesh. The more popular implementation came out of Twitter. Lyft has also done some work around this, and there's a company called Buoyant that does a lot of work around that as well. But what's interesting, what service mesh allows you to do is, there was a DevOps paradigm that came very popular where you would put HA proxy in front of every single instance of your application. And the reason why is because HA proxy had this ability to do circuit breakers and things like that, and to test the application and then take the application instance offline for you. And the other load balancers would automatically see that the service is unavailable, and they would automatically pull it out of the pool. Your main load balancer would. So they've taken this idea and they've started to apply it to a cloud native world, and service mesh really allows you to do that. So you can automatically offload a lot of things like TLS termination, so that you don't have to package up certificates inside of your containers, which you shouldn't do. You should be using a key store for that or something like that in the first place. But it makes solving that problem a lot easier because it's only on one layer you need to do it. You can automatically pull back service metrics, but the more important thing is that it can automatically detect abnormal conditions and respond. So take instances out, relaunch new instances, and so forth. You can also do scaling of traffic and other things like that, like we talked about in 10 deploys a day of doing A/B testing and things like that. Service mesh makes this a lot easier. So for the measurement aspects, it gives you a common instrumentation point, and a great example of this is Prometheus. It allows developers to easily instrument their code. They know that they're going to have this endpoint that's pulling all of the data off of their application, and in the inside of their application, they can instrument their individual function calls and things like that with great ease. And instrumentation really focuses on this idea of visibility, which has been key to DevOps for a long time. And then you have where if I allow my developers to easily instrument all of their code, then I need to be able to pull back all of that instrumentation and make sense of an entire service request. And you have tools like distributed tracing tools like Jaeger and Open Tracing that allows you to correlate events through a distributed stack. So if you have a highly distributed microservices architecture, you can pull back all of the timings from those different services, aggregate them, and much like if you open Firefox or Chrome and you open the developer view and you go down to the network tab and then make a request in your browser, and you'll see how long it took for the whole request, and then it'll break it down to each page element and how long each page element took. That's very similar to what you can do with distributed tracing tools as well. And you get a higher visibility into bottlenecks, sources of failure, and potential points to optimize as well, like we were talking about doing that future state map, removing waste from the system with lean processes. This gives you an idea of where are my slowest services, so if I need to make the entire request faster, I know where I can go and optimize. And then it also gives you a common instrumentation point for service performance, and then you don't have to go and write a lot of that stuff yourself inside of your application code. It's removed and abstracted away for you. So things like successes, retries, error rates, and other metrics like that matter. And lean really starts to kind of be a side effect of cloud native. So what happens is that we've started to build these processes into the actual the way that we work. And so the processes are improved to increase velocity and agility. We're not worried about the low-lying infrastructure where there's often a lot of time spent and a lot of waste in that area, and we're moving one level higher up. And that's mainly because we're removing a lot of points of friction as well. And then your best practices are automated into the platform. So these ideas of having circuit breakers and other things like that automatically get baked in, to have automatic scaling and responsiveness from a scaling perspective, having resource limits and other things like that. We're forcing those into the platform and making sure that you have those things so that you can more easily have this increased velocity and agility. So let's go back to one of the foundational talk of DevOps, if you will, and let's talk about this idea of what 10 deploys a day actually talked about. So they laid out 6 technical areas and 4 cultural areas as well that you should focus on. And so you have things like automated infrastructure, shared version control, so a lot of ideas of infrastructure as code came from that as well. One-step build and deploy, including small, frequent changes, much like microservices is why you have microservices architectures, because you have a smaller component that you need to change, and it should be easier to change. Having things like feature flags, so you can turn things on and off automatically in your code base, but also maybe in your infrastructure as well. And then the idea of IRC and IAM robots or ChatOps. And then the cultural aspects, respect, trust, healthy attitudes towards failure, and avoiding blame. So if we go back to what I just talked about in automation, lean, and measurement and how they overlap with cloud native, you can see that all of these 5 things are really kind of starting to be baked into this paradigm of cloud native and this new way that we operate from a technological perspective. These things are built into the platform, and it makes it much easier for us to start to move fast because these things are done for us and we don't have to start to worry about all of these concerns. So you might be asking yourselves, well, what about my DevOps team? What am I supposed to do now? And so the first thing I would say is DevOps team is a misnomer, and this is, you might be thinking that this is old man stands up here and yells at DevOps. But it's important to understand why DevOps team is a misnomer. If you want to have a DevOps team, if you want to be the VP of DevOps at your organization, if you want to be a DevOps engineer, I don't care. Call yourself what you want. Titles don't matter. Somebody told me that I should be a director of advocacy because that's the new hot thing, and evangelism is kind of an old played-out word, and I'm like, I don't really care. So call yourselves what you want, but you have to understand the connotations behind that, right? And so ask yourselves, do you mean my cultural and professional movement team? So if you go back to that definition that Adam Jacob gave, and you apply that definition and put team on the end, does that really work, right? Or is DevOps something more about the organization? And you have to ask yourselves, what does DevOps team do for cultural lean, measurement, and sharing aspects of DevOps? And what you probably mean is your automation team, because you have that layer of A, L, and M in the middle of DevOps, and you have all of that automation that you were supposed to be automating and building in, and the principles of measurement and lean and so forth. And usually what you're doing in the DevOps team is you're building platforms for people. And so the DevOps team is really what you would call a developer services team, right? You have, and Joe on his blog post, he's actually got a multi-series blog post, and he talks a lot more about jobs in a cloud native world, and he talks, basically starts to silo out, not silo out, because I don't want to say silo out, because he does point out that it is kind of like he's creating silos again, but different areas of operations, and what each area of operations does in a cloud native type world, and it's a pretty good blog post to look at. But if you think about what a DevOps team is actually offering, it's things like continuous delivery pipeline infrastructure, automation frameworks, automation testing frameworks, and so forth, artifact repositories. So it's basically enabling the developers to go fast, right? And giving them a platform that has those A, L, and M principles built into it, right? And then you have this term that's come up recently, where over the last couple of years it came out of Google, of site reliability engineering. And so then you have some people that say, well, I just became this DevOps team. Do I need to now become an SRE team and change everything that we're doing? Or do we just rebrand ourselves in the organization? And if you look at site reliability engineering, the definition from Wikipedia actually goes into great detail about what are the principles of site reliability engineering and how they overlap with the 5 principles of DevOps that they lay out in that as well. And that's a really good example to show that your DevOps initiatives don't necessarily go away just because we have newfangled technology. The way that we leverage those DevOps initiatives might change. And the other thing that is a very good talk is a talk by a lady from Google, Liz Fong-Jones, and Seth Vargo. It's what's the difference between DevOps and SRE. And they make the statement in there that SRE implements DevOps, right? So SREs are responsible for helping the organization implement those ideas of culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing. So you might ask yourself, so what about my DevOps transformation? DevOps transformations are still important. DevOps is the entire organization's job. And the other challenge with the whole DevOps team title is that it takes focus away that DevOps is the entire organization's job. One team isn't going to be able to go in and build your culture in your organization. I had a friend tell me that he went over to a company recently, and he was at a company where DevOps was a thing, where it was like they would have internal DevOps days, and they would easily get 300 or 400 people in their internal DevOps days, and then they would have several other 100 that are remote that would also be dialed in as well. And they had this cultural thing going in the entire organization, and he went to this new company, and he's trying to do a DevOps days of 300 people, and his management has went to him and said, well, I thought we just wanted like a 12-person DevOps team, and that's all you were going to do. Like, what do we got to do and change the entire organization? Cloud Native is a culmination of these technological advances that has taken place since 2009 and when the term DevOps was first coined. And Cloud Native provides real benefits around these aspects of agility and velocity. And we definitely need to be welcoming to these new technological paradigms because they have a lot that they can offer to the broader DevOps community as well. So thank you. Some links. I'll post these slides as well so you can get to the other links that I didn't put up on this page. But some ones you should definitely look at is what's the difference between DevOps and SRE, and then the original post of what DevOps means to me as well. And of course, I put my sponsor information up there because, you know. But also, if you want to tweet at me, that's my Twitter handle as well. Thank you.